Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day. This is Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day.
The views and opinions of the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the position of the management and staff of Guardian Network.
Guardian Radio 96.9 FM, your station for fresh news, smart talk all day. It is Thursday, the 15th of August, 2024, and you are on the clock with Erin, Greene. On the clock, we engage organizations, institutions, social and cultural leaders, and ordinary people to better understand the impact of public policy, private sector development, and emerging social and consumer trends. On the clock, we have conversations that help us understand and navigate a rapidly changing Bahamas. Good morning, Bahamas. It's the Ides of August. For all of my Shakespeare fans out there, we have a very interesting show for you today. Over the 2 hours of On the Clock in Guardian Radio AM, we're going to have a conversation on the Grand Bahama Port Authority and the current issues arising between the Grand Bahama Port Authority and the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. The first half of the show, we will learn about the GBPA, what it is, how it was established, when and for what purpose, the function of the GBPA, explainer on the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. We're going to establish some terms, GBPC, Grand Bahama Power Company, Hawksbill Creek Act and Hawksbill Creek Agreement, and again, Grand Bahama Port Authority. Joining us in this conversation this morning will be Mr. C. Alan Johnson, a political advocate, technology expert, and social commentator. Mr. C.A. Nuri is going to lead the conversation. He said he's going to frame it up. He's going to frame it up. There's only two things I know about Grand Bahama, Mr. Nuri.
It's the Magic City?
I didn't even know that.
Oh, they had magic?
Corinne Mitchell wouldn't let us off the... Is magic the same as Obeah?
It is.
You sure?
It's like there's church magic and then there's...
Okay, I understand. The church attached make it magic.
Yeah.
Anyway, I only know two things about Grand Bahama.
Go ahead.
They had cable TV before all of us, and they used to watch the Jackson 5 cartoon before we even knew it existed in Nassau.
Yes.
And the second thing is it's get dead cold in Grand Bahama sometimes.
It's up north.
Yeah, that's all I know.
Yes.
So I'm hoping that you lead the conversation this morning, and I will follow along as we interrogate C. Alan Johnson and learn more about the Grand Bahama Port Authority, the entities, the mechanisms it manages, its function and purpose. And then we get into the aspects of the discussion taking place between the GBPA and the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas.
Yes. And also, before all of that, I want to read some of the articles to the record.
Okay.
So the listening audience could be aware of why we are doing this. We're trying to help the listening audience and ourselves to understand why there is a public row at this present time, there is definitely a public row. The government might say, no, we're not doing this publicly. We're just responding to the Grand Bahama Port Authority. And they are doing the public row. But there's definitely a row happening, and there's an exchange. And we're trying to understand either why, and then understand how did the row come about. And like you said, C. Allen will join us shortly and log in. But we want to frame the conversation so those listening can appreciate what we are attempting to do. And so when because this can be a court battle to me. I remember some weeks ago when we started this conversation, I said, this is going to court because I think this is a constitutional issue. And there were callers who said, this can't be constitutional. And I mentioned that because the Port Authority existed before we became independent, that it was grandfathered in to our Constitution that it existed. Right? Which makes it a constitutional issue. And hopefully we'll be able to interrogate that, investigate that, and have some conversation on that. But it's safe to say that Grand Bahama, or by extension, the port is what we're talking about, is broken. It's not functioning as it should be or would we anticipated it to be. And that our government, and the previous government, because I remember with the last deputy prime minister, gentleman from Grand Bahama, from the F&M, name escapes me. Last, he was deputy prime minister and leader of the name just gone. Turnquest. He also led a charge in order what is happening in Grand Bahama. So I just want to say that government has been consistent. It's not just one administration, but a number of governments, administrations wanted to fix.
Right, and so
brokenness in Grand Bahama.
I just want to ask, we're not necessarily interrogating whether things are things in Grand Bahama, right? Like, we're not questioning whether the GBPA, or we're not questioning whether Freeport is performing at the level it should do. We all agree that it's not.
Yes.
The question is, who is at fault?
Who's at fault? And that's where it is. Who's at fault and what each person's role is supposed to be. We're going to hold the government juxtaposed to the Grand Bahama Port Authority and find out what is the Port Authority's role and what is the government's role. What is Freeport proper? What is Grand Bahama, right? And what was their responsibilities and who is negating their responsibilities. So all of that is with the narrative on, and then have the Bahamian people conclude.
Right, and also, so I have here, what is the purpose, role, and function of the GBPA, and what is the scope of their authority, right? Not just in terms of what are they allowed to do and not allowed to do, but what is the geographical area that they govern, right? Yes. Is it Freeport itself, the free trade zone? Mm-hmm. In the subsequent amendments to the Hawksbill Creek Act, has the geographic area that they govern expanded beyond the technical boundaries of Freeport? And exactly what is it that the GBPA is responsible for on Grand Bahama, and what is the government responsible for on Grand Bahama? Okay.
So let's start with the route. Let's start with the article. And then as soon as we get C. Allen Johnson connected, we can have him join the conversation. Because I want to understand Hawksbill Creek Agreement, right? Oh, he's on? Okay. Right. Hawksbill Creek Agreement, right?
Right.
And the mandate the Hawksbill Creek Agreement gave the Grand Bahama Port Authority, right?
Right.
And in terms of that bonded vehicle, in terms of that management system, in terms of what is a quasi-government, what is the responsibility? Because it's now a public row about taxes and whether the Port Authority is the authority in terms of what taxes could happen. And how that juxtaposed even in terms of VAT, because the port is supposed to be a free port void of taxes, right? And that whatever taxes happen, the port will implement. That's what I thought. And that's not seems to be happening. But we're going to do all of that.
And so I guess another question is, what type of is Freeport?
Yes.
Okay, I got you.
But let's start reading these articles, the pieces which we could read, and then we'll start basic questions. Basic
right.
questions.
So
right?
these are the articles that
Yes.
I gathered for today's discussion. I'll read the first paragraph of each article. So the first one, GB Power seeks 6.3% hike. Right? That's where I sort of started my research and the discussion about the rate increase, right? So the Grand Bahama Power company said it submitted a rate plan proposal to the Grand Bahama Port Authority for consideration on August 1st. The plan is to increase the base rate for Grand Bahama customers by 6.3% in 2025. The GBPC, that's the Grand Bahama Power Company, said its request would sustain operations and future investments and would help align its operations with the government's target of 30% renewable energy by 2030. The GBPC said the requested 6.3% base rate increase is below the country's recent inflation rate of 7.3%. Second article, same day, different newspaper. GBPC files rate plan proposal with GBPA, no mention of IRCA. That's again August the 7th, 2024, and this is the Nassau Guardian. The Grand Bahama Power Company continues to consider the Grand Bahama Port Authority its regulator, revealing in a statement released yesterday that it has filed a rate plan proposal with the GBPA, despite the government removing the GBPA in law as the power company's regulator. The government and the Utilities Regulation and Competition Authority both contend that IRCA is the regulating authority for power production companies throughout the Bahamas. However, the GBPA has insisted even since the creation of IRCA, and still insists, despite GBPA out of the Electricity Act, that language in the Hawksbill Creek Agreement makes it the regulator for power production on the Grand Bahama. Third article, unreasonable. Nassau Guardian, Monday the 12th of August. Prime Minister Brave Davis said on Friday that Grand Bahama Power Company's request for an electricity rate increase is, quote, unreasonable, close quotes. Davis also hit out at the Grand Bahama Port Authority and its assertion it is the sole licensor and regulator of all utilities in Freeport. Davis said under the law there's only one regulator with the power to approve a rate increase, IRCA. He was referring to a new Electricity Act that was passed earlier this year, which establishes IRCA as the only regulator in the country's energy sector. However, GBPA has asserted its rights as the regulator for electricity on Grand Bahama, citing its powers as outlined in the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. Fourth article, government may take GBPC rate issue to court, 14th of August. PLP Chairman Fred Mitchell said yesterday the government is prepared to take legal action over the Grand Bahama Power Company's decision to increase rates without approval from IRCA. It would seem to me the next course of action is to injunct them from carrying it out, Mitchell told reporters. He made the comments when asked about an ongoing disagreement between the government and the GBPA over which entity is the regulator for the Grand Bahama Power Company. GBPA operates Freeport under special powers conferred by the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, which was signed in 1955 between the government and businessman Wallace Groves to establish Freeport, a free trade zone on Grand Bahama, aim being to foster economic development. The GBPA argues that the HCA defines its role as, quote, the sole exclusive licensor and regulator for all utilities in the port area, close quotes. Last article, Grand Bahama had enough of rising costs. Residents in Grand Bahama have had enough of rising costs on the island, especially with the island's economy not being as robust as anticipated, according to the local Chamber of Commerce president. After dozens of Grand Bahama residents protested GBPC's proposed 6.3% rate hike on Monday, James Carey of the Grand Bahama Chamber of Commerce said a potential electricity rate increase would have a damaging effect on the local economy as it would increase the cost of doing business. Mr. Carey said implementing a rate increase would propel the island into a, quote, vicious cycle, close quotes, of increased costs, as businesses would be forced to increase the prices of their goods and services to maintain their bottom line.
Yes. And we know things pricey, so we're not talking about whether increase will impact Grand Bahama. We're talking about who has the authority. That's our conversation today. So this is when we invite our guest, C. Allen Johnson, on. We're going to try to have our conversation concise. So we more likely will have to interject and make sure he answer our direct questions based on his knowledge and his skill, etc. Right? Let's confirm. C. Allen, you there? Let me know when you're on, because I know you're connected to Zoom. Just make sure your mic is up and ready, and just interject and let us know that you're on so we can start our conversation.
As we wait for him, what was interesting about the GB had enough of rising costs article is that I think reps from the power company, customers should expect a reduction in rates, right? Like the increase in that base rate, right, would be balanced with the decrease in the fuel surcharge rate, and that actually customers should see a slight decrease.
That's similar to what they saying with BPL
In New Providence.
Just that my bill went up, but that's okay. That's okay. C. Allen, how are you doing? I just heard you earlier. Gone again? Okay, we'll continue until we hear him again. I know we heard him just now. And we know that in 1955, there's a Hawksbill Creek Agreement where it gave a mandate to the port to create a free zone, right? And from my understanding, right, this free zone was managed.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. This free zone was managed by the Port Authority. And at that point in time, they were the regulators. They were the licensor or licensee for utilities at that time, I assume. And of course, recently we created IRCA. IRCA became the licensor, the national licensor, or licensee, and made a conflict between what initially was intended to what the government of the Bahamas needed or wanted for the whole Bahamas. Now, was that legal or not is a legal question, which the Grand Bahama Port Authority is saying they remain or maintain their right to be the licensee, and that they're willing to fight in court. And of course, the government said they're willing to sue. So that more than likely has to go to the court, right? And one or the other needs, because I know this thing is going through arbitration. The Prime Minister mentioned this word arbitration before, but clearly it needs to be finally decided so we can move forward and understand as a nation. But see, Allen, what is the, I need a short narrative as best you can, okay, a rundown of what is the mandate from the Hawksbill Creek Agreement for the Port Authority?
Well, what is it? When was it formed? And what is its mandate?
Yes.
Its function, its purpose, its role, and scope of authority.
As short as you can.
Okay, sure, Cal. Let me start from the end and come back because you asked a question concerning the lawsuit.
No. We come to the lawsuit. Don't worry about that. We're just trying to understand that thing.
Well, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement is a trust that was established in 1955. I want you to understand, and I know a lot of Beamers may not take this, but the staff of SANS was a genius in the creation of this document and what its intent is. In fact, if for those who understand the document, even though later in 2054, if you understand the way trust works or this way this one was structured, it was meant to continue way beyond 2054, almost like the Hong Kong model that you hear about. After the 99-year lease, Hong Kong still exists, it still functions, etc. So this trust was established between the Bahamian people and the Grand Bahama Port Authority, Waters Groves at the time. Clearly, looking at it, you'll see that his wife served as the primary signature on that for a number of reasons that we're not going to go into today. But it was established as a trust between the government of the Bahamas for the Bahamian people and the Grand Bahama Port Authority. As licensees came on, that trust became subject to a change by the licensees. Currently, it is 80% of the licensees must agree to change the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. Now, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement is essentially law. It's known as the Deepwater Harbor Act. Even though we talk about it as if though it's some separate standalone agreement, it's law.
No, what you mean by it's law?
It's an act. I think 265 and a couple act in the law. It isn't as like some agreements separate. It was passed as a law. So when you talk about the Constitution, it is subject to the Constitution, just like any other law.
Now, see,
So
Alan,
this is
let's just make a distinction between the agreement and the act, right?
the agreement, the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, but it is the act,
Okay, I got you. Good stuff. Thank you.
right? You're right. So it's there. So what happens though is that and this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, because individuals refer to this as there's some agreement that exists someplace out there, and it isn't. So essentially, a good book for people to read will be the Royal Commission report, I think in 1971 or somewhere around there, that actually that was published by the Royal Commission. But essentially, in August 4th, 1955, this first agreement, as you could refer to it, was established. It was amended again in July of 1960, and I think it was further amended in 1966.
Yes.
There's been no major amendment of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement since then. There has been some expiration of some things were supposed to expire in 1985, and that was moved to August of 1990. In 1993, retroactively, a bill was passed to deal with those tax concessions that was attached as part of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. We often refer to it as an extension of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, but it was not an extension. It was more a law was passed to delay the implementation of certain tenets of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement. So like the taxes expiring, the real property taxes expiring, et cetera, corporate taxes exemption, it was expiring. So that aspect was delayed for 25 years, retroactively to 1990, which then expired in 2015. In 2015, the Progressive Liberal Party under Mr. Peregas Christie appointed a committee to explore the further delay implementation of this agreement, or how it's supposed to change. That was a report that was supposed to be released to the Bahamian people to date that has not been released. They also commissioned a McKinsey report to give the full breakdown of the economics of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, which was all supposed to be released to the government. That has not been done. During the opposition of Mr. Hubert Alexander Minnis, he made a demand straight till 20 May of 2017 that it's a public document and it should be released. During his term, he refused to release it. Now the Progressive Liberal Party is back in there, and they have the opportunity to release this McKinsey report, this report on the Hawksbill Creek Agreement, the study that's supposed to be to give us the full things on it, which would then bring us to the monies that is being owed, because I'm sure these reports would have addressed this, because the monies that is being owed is going back from, I think, 2018 to 2022 or 2017 to 2022. And it'll be very good for us to understand what the government of the Bahamas is demanding on our behalf. Now, understand this. This is not the government of the Bahamas in isolation. The government of the Bahamas is a trustee for the Bahamian people. So you should not be acting on behalf of the trustees without keeping the trustees updated, like nothing for us without us. But we have never been, in the purest sense, updated in the fullness of what is being represented.
1 minute. You're saying that the government of the Bahamas is a trustee to the port?
They represent us, yeah.
And
Right,
they're
right.
trust. Once upon a time, they said that the government of the Bahamas, on our behalf. Once upon a time, they said that the government of the Bahamas owns shares.
They still do.
They still do. How many shares
The reason I said that, the 7.5%, and let me say why they still do. The only way, in spite of in 2008, Hubert Alexander Ingram simply saying that the shares are being disposed of, and I think it almost alluded that he knows, but he won't say. Something of that sort, right? It's an article I have somewhere. But we've never been told. But the problem with that is that you can't dispose of any assets of the government without going to Parliament. So there's never been any Parliament record already on this as to when, where, how, who they dispose of the 7.5% of the shares of the Hawksbill Creek Agreement.
So more than likely, we still have the 7.5%.
We should. No, we in law we do. Absolutely. I don't care in practice, because until Parliament approves it. And so, that came as part of something called a Bengay Agreement, when the sale of the Grand Bahama Port Authority was happening. Some people had some shares in it, and they wanted to dispose of it. It's not complicated, but it's a long process to say this is what happens. So in exchange to allow these things to happen, the government ended up at 7.5% and in the 70s, and somewhere since then, no one seems to be able to account for the 7.5% or for the dividends that should have been dispersed as part of that 7.5%. I want you to make one important note. Ever since the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement started, there's always been a minister for the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement. It was the Premier Simonet, followed by the Premier Lyndon Pinlin, followed by Prime Minister Lyndon Pinlin, followed by Prime Minister Hubert Ingraham, followed by one time David Thompson, back to Prime Minister Hubert Ingraham, back to Perry Christie, back to Hubert Ingraham, back to Perry Christie, and to Hubert Minnis, and now the Minister for Freeport, which is the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement, is the current Prime Minister, which is a separate position from the Minister for Grand Bahama. Okay, that's two different, and we often never even discussed it, but in fact, it was approximated that every 2 years that are you there? Still there?
Yeah, still there.
It's approximated that every 2 years an audited report of the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement would have been tabled in Parliament, but it's never been done.
Who's responsible for producing that report? Is it the GBPA or
Bahama Port Authority? But would get the same where you get an international accounting firm who would prepare it, give it to the Minister of Finance, who would then table it in the House of Assembly.
Right. See, Alan.
Something. Right. Just I'm saying.
Go on.
For people to understand, this historical narrative of Freeport, which involves the Abaco Lumber Company, a vacation village in West End, and it is a very important aspect of our history, and on how what it is and what it was supposed to become, because it was supposed to be developed for the benefit of all Bahamians. I often hear people talk about as if though this agreement is exclusivity is for the residents of Freeport. No, the area is called Freeport. In fact, the name became incidental because Freeport means something different in these type of environment. It means where people put whole goods and stuff for transition and various different things. Because there is other Freeports around the world, but we adopted it as an actual name because they meant to establish a free space port to which bring the development of the island.
Is that the same thing as a free trade zone? Like the intent was to establish a free trade zone?
Yes, and believe it or not, I think in the purest sense, we may have been the third or the fifth, I don't know, in the world, but the most powerful in the world, because every single free trade in the world today, I think there's maybe over 1,000 or whatever, used the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement as a template. So that's how powerful this is.
Let me ask you this. We need to establish the mandate of the Grand Bahama Port Authority. What was their mandate? And my second question is, what all does the Grand Bahama Port Authority owns in terms of property and assets purchased on behalf of the Freeport?
Well, initially, the government had invested almost 50,000 acres, I think, to the Grand Bahama Port Authority. They were supposed to acquire about another 1,400 acres. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. But essentially, they also established the utilities for this development, and that's where the water and sanitation and other things came into place. They also got the ability to regulate.
No, repeat that part so I can understand that.
They got the authority to establish the utilities in this new city and to regulate it. But these utilities weren't separate entities. They were almost like departments within the Grand Bahama Port Authority. It's almost like an electrical department of the Grand Bahama Port Authority, a water department of the Grand Bahama Port Authority, those type of things. It was later on, during the later years, that these things evolved into being corporate entities and separate assets. And so, if you'll have to jump to the 90s to understand when a certain aspect of their vestation of the assets that was part of the Grand Bahama Port Authority as a whole began. And that's where the selling off of, where we use the expression that a group of people found a means to say these assets was worth a certain amount of money, and they start selling off these assets, the power company, and I think sanitation services, whatever the assets is. In essence, in the pure sense, I'll tell you today, the Grand Bahama Port Authority owns no assets.
What?
And because what happens, the GBPA owns no assets. It's a regulatory form of regime, because the assets over the years have been divested into multiple companies outside of the GBPA that is littered around the world, including mostly residing in the Cayman Islands. And you saw those disclosures happen when the two principals was fighting against themselves. And so, but the Grand Bahama Port Authority itself still maintains the municipal aspect of it. But essentially, in the selling of these different things, like at the time when they got rid of the power company and it became a public power company, I think it started with Southern Electric. One time it was owned by a company in Japan. Then it came back to, and so it's just owned by multiple people, now owned by Amera.
So you said a number of assets was sold, and the Grand Bahama Authority became the regulator of these assets.
They've always been, right, yes, they have, the regulator of these assets. They maintain principally what was mandated to them of the Hawkesbury Creek, in the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement. Now, there's a very touchy area, and I'm going to kind of touch on the lawsuit.
No, we ain't get there yet. No, don't rush it.
The reason I'm saying that is that there was a difference between their responsibility to provide these services versus being a regulator.
Okay. I also want to have a definition of licensees. You said that there were a number of licensees came aboard, and people, like, in quotes, my words, for not having the correct vocabulary, became not asset holders, investors into the Port Authority. That the Port Authority is not owned by. Go ahead.
Not into the Port Authority. They became investors into the port area. See, don't confuse. See, what happens is, though you may have these companies like the power company and the sanitation services and other things, at the time going back, say, pre-1990, they were not. Those things came out to become separate licensees, but individuals who came to Grand Bahama to invest made application to the Grand Bahama Port Authority to partake of the benefits of the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement, such as now this word duty free was not part of it. It was tax exempt. We used the word duty free as if there was tax exempt access to a lot of the products and things for manufacturing, industrial, and other businesses. And believe it or not, at one time, Grand Bahama was a primary hospitality destination. And so when you came into Freeport, you made application to the Port Authority to partake of the benefits, and you paid a licensing fee. At the time, I think maybe 95% or maybe more of those licensees were non-Bahamians until the Ben or Break speech. Today, 95% of those of the licensees in Freeport is Bahamian owned.
So you're saying that the majority of the licensees now are Bahamians who have interest in the port area?
Yes, absolutely. And you could consider, in some perspective, you could consider landowners as quasi-licensees. Though they don't have individual votes as part of the whole collective, the way you would say the licensees would get together for 80% of the vote. If they wanted to vote, they would have to come together as a collective, like almost like constituencies, because there's a number of developments on Grand Bahama, such as Bahia, Hutchinson Estates. The whole of Freeport is broken down into sections, and so those they would have to, they don't come from that particular area. You don't get to choose. You don't go, I'm part of Humanwood and I get to vote individually. Human Wood would have to come in because they have a license. Human Wood Development have a license. Golden Glades have Golden and Greene and Glade have a license. Forest have a license. Fortune Bay has a license. Seahorse Village has a license. Coral Reef has a license. All of these are development coral estates. I know them all over my head in any particular order.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. There is a narrative that
Royal Beacon Estates, Lucaine Beach, Silver Cove.
See, Alan,
Right.
there's a narrative that suggests that the Port Authority
Yes, I'm
is
here.
foreign owned. And you suggesting that the majority is Bahamian who have licensees. Is it a foreign? Because the narrative saying that it's the foreigners that do invest. Correct that narrative, or tell us the narrative for that, please. Sorry.
No, they're not right. Don't combine the licensees who get their license from the Grand Bahama Port Authority with the Grand Bahama Port Authority principal owner. And so the Grand Bahama Port Authority stands alone as a quasi-government. We like to use the word. I don't see them as a quasi-government in the truest aspect, but they do have regulatory powers or had regulatory powers in that respect. So, and I guess for better understanding, we adopted that statement of some quasi-government because of what they do. But what happens is there is two families that became the principal owners of the Grand Bahama Port Authority after acquiring it from Wallace Groves, and that is the Hayward family and the St. George's family. And so when people talk about the foreigners, they are referring to, I think they directly or indirectly referring to the St. George family and to the Hayward family. I know Sarah St. George, who leads the St. George aspect of it. I may be mistaken, but she may be a Bahamian, but she was not Bahamian born. She came here with her father, Everett St. George, who was a magistrate or judge or something of that sort during her early years in the 50s or 60s or something of that sort. But he came here first, went away, then he came back. It's a very unique story about him coming here, coming back, supposedly fell in love with the Bahamas and said he would never leave. And then the Haywoods, you have to understand, the Haywoods was almost here from the very beginning, because we see the current Rupert Haywood, part of the fifth generation. Let me go back here. Rupert Haywood, you have his father, you have Sir Charles, and then you have the grandfather. So the grandfather came in the 50s in respect when the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement began to originally came together. He wasn't, I don't know if he was there at the origin, but he was definitely there within 3 years. He was involved, I think, as a consul to Wallace Groves.
So let me ask you this. Who was the last entity, who increased the rate for the utilities in the Grand Bahama Port? I mean, for the Power and Light, Grand Bahama Power and Light.
Grand Bahama Port Authority has always been the authority that has increased the rate right up until the modification of this bill, the bill in the 2024 electricity bill. Even when in 2015 or something around it, when the bill came about, that was being contested in court. The problem is that after they changed the 2024 bill, that even though for 7-8 years, whatever time they've been in court trying to determine who is the right licensee, that fell away. And this new 2024 bill was supposed to fix the defects that they thought that the 2015 or 2016, whatever the bill was, did not address to give the government the full power. The question that we asked that has to be answered now, there's a number of things that happened that a lot of people may not even seem to understand. There's some changes that happened in the early years, like for instance, when in 1968, the government wrote a letter to the Grand Bahama Port Authority that before any new rates are imposed or change were made in this existing tariffs or rates, the utility service operated under the authority of Clause 221, which is the one they're having right now of the 1955 agreement. The Grand Bahama Port Authority Limited will first submit proposal to the appropriate minister, listen to it very carefully, minister of the government, and should not introduce any new such rates or changes without the proper written agreement of that minister. But since this time, we've had the Public Utilities Commission then transition into IRCA, and we've not had any contesting of the Grand Bahama Port Authority right to approve rate increases. This was actually written when the Grand Bahama Port Authority actually produced the energy themselves. Now, the thing about it is that I hear people talk about the Grand Bahama Port Authority and East and West power generation. I don't want to suck in too much time on that because there was agreements to generate power for the East and the West long before even the sale of the assets of the Port Authority. And so, but the question then becomes though, and this is a legal question I've been seeking to have answered, is when did this part of this agreement that they agreed to in 1968 during that part of the amendment or this letter from the government to them, how did this transition, what happened during that time up until the time that they have? So one could naturally assume that either the government has been derelict in their duty up until 2024, or the Port Authority do have the right under the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement to approve those rates.
See, Alan,
The problem I
we're about 8 minutes away from the end of this segment. I got a lot of texts here. I want to put the texts on the table because, of course, they're all about this part of the show before we may transition into another aspect of the discussion on the second half. So I want to just start there. One texter says, hey, you sound a bit muffled. Can you adjust your sound?
Okay.
I think I'm hearing you clearly from the studio, but that's the next thing. So let's go back to the top of the list. Now, I got a texter here that said, hey, they feel like you should declare your political affiliation. This came in at the top of the show. Listening to the conversation today, I don't think that's necessary. I think you have provided a nonpartisan explainer.
No, but let me just say this. Let me say this, right?
Yeah.
That person, whoever said that text, is actually being facetious or malicious because, they really don't know me. For 25 years across 5 administrations, no one could question my loyalty and challenging every single administration to do what is right, not just for the entire Bahamas, but more so for Freeport. And I would challenge anyone to tell.
All right. Thank you.
To me.
Exercise.
Yeah, man.
Let's continue.
I just wanted to put that out there. I feel like this has been a nonpartisan discussion. Next text. How can the government amend the terms of the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement without following the process outlined in the agreement itself? If this fascist government can do that, they can also take away its licensing authority and other powers. This is an easy call for any judge with at least a third-class degree from college.
I would agree. I would agree because what happens is you can't amend the agreement without either striking down the law totally or having the 80% of the licensees agree to any modification.
To the modification amendment. Okay, another text. Excellent talk show today. The government is a shareholder, also directors at the Port Authority. Now the government is a licensee of GBPA. So what is the government's role in all of this for Grand Bahama? This text is from Grand Bahama.
It's not a licensee.
Okay, so the government is not a licensee.
No, but they're right. But the government do have a right based on the changes that I'm not aware of to appoint members of the board. They did appoint them. I haven't heard for a number of years that any appointment, but the government did over the last 20 years have people that they appointed to the board of the Grand Bahama Port Authority.
All right. See, Alan, this text came in at about 10:27, and I'm not sure who the text is directed at, but here we go. Listeners find it quite funny that you're upset about the request by Grand Bahama Power Company for a rate increase. Maybe you should mention the fact that the whole of the Bahamas had a BPL tax increase, and you haven't mentioned that at all approved by ERCA. You also might want to read the Hawkesbury Creek Agreement so you understand how this island works instead of just guessing. I'm not quite sure who the text is addressing here.
That's a good text. That's a good text.
Yeah.
Let me tell you something. ERCA approved the rates on Grand Bahama, but it didn't request the rate changes that they did or the fact that for the next 3 years, ERCA will have no authority to approve rate changes anywhere across the Bahamas. And so...
Who will have that authority?
The minister.
ERCA. The minister, right. The minister will. And so this is where a form of hypocrisy sits in. Clearly, this is something I think the leader of the opposition mentioned, and then I checked, and I found it to be true, is that So it's like if we're going to have a standard in the Bahamas, then the standard should be for all of the Bahamas, not just for Freeport. And this is where this comes in, where we change the variant standard, because I'm concerned about those individuals in New Providence also having the same protection from IRCA that they do. Now, but just let me say this, right? For Grand Bahamians and everyone else, Emera, the Grand Bahama Power Company, has a right, an absolute right to ask for rate increase. They do not approve any rate increase. So even the protest against the Grand Bahama Power Company, for me, is misdirected, because they could request 50% rate increase. It's the Grand Bahama Port Authority, if they have the power, or IRCA, that has to approve it.
Or the minister.
The protest, right, or the protest should be against those individuals to tell them, no, do not do it. And so we have to be very direct in our request. You can't stand in front of my yard, scream and give you back your mangoes when I'm taking your grapes.
And this was for my benefit. Recently, the government changed the law, removing IRCA for being the regulator, and put that to the minister.
Yeah,
I want to know if that impacted Grand Bahama also.
Right. If the law that they said covers the entire Bahamas, then you'd have to also say that the government is screaming the same thing what the government did, then covers all of the Bahamas. So the government is pointing towards IRCA when it's the minister who would determine the rate increase.
Interesting.
So I'm saying, because you can't say IRCA governs the entire Bahamas, and for the next 3 years, IRCA suspended and the minister do it, but then come to Freeport and says, well, IRCA will decide for Freeport. It can't be two ways. And so again, this is where the government has failed to bring clarity in this particular situation, the Grand Bahama.
All right.
In fact, I think that they owe it to us to come to Grand Bahama and explain to us in person. Oh, we already have a minute.
Yeah, we right at that point, see, Alan. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to break on the clock for the commercial. We're wrapping up the show, and then we're going to pick you back up on the other side in Guardian Radio AM. So don't zoom out, zoom in.
I won't.
Thank you. You've been on the clock with Erin Greene. Joining me this morning is C.A. Newry. On the second show, Guardian Radio AM with C.A. Newry, we're going to continue the conversation with C. Alan Johnson from Grand Bahama, exploring, interrogating the relationship between the Grand Bahama Port Authority and the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and of course, those who the government acts for, the citizens of the Bahamas. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Guardian Radio, 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day.
Hey Bahamas, ready for some eye-openers? Check out 2 brand new books by our legendary 3-time PM, Hubert Ingram. Get the tea on his amazing leadership and courage to buck the system. These books are for you, the game changers, movers and shakers, and anyone passionate about our nation's roots and future. Available now at Dungalik Studios, Logos Bookstore, the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, and Chapter 1 Bookstore. Score your copies today. Celebrate our amazing legacy.
Love the show? Want to give your support? Become a sponsor today. Call 302-2300 for our rates and packages. That's 302-2300. Become a sponsor on Guardian Radio 96.9 FM. Fresh news, smart talk, all day.
This is Guardian Radio 96.9 FM, Nassau, Bahamas.